see the numbers of our participants trickle up. So give it a second for everyone to come in. Excited to see you all. Give it another second here. Hello, everybody, and happy Thursday. I'm Diane Buis here at MedTech Innovator, where I'm director of the US program. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live number 6 in our series of weekly webinars that we do as part of our accelerator program that runs for 4 months. And this is an opportunity for the 88 companies across our 3 cohorts to learn from experts all across the ecosystem. So for those joining us on the live stream, MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator of medical devices in the world. And it's a downstream accelerator, which means that we're not looking for people with ideas, but people with companies that are up and running, have teams, have prototypes and early evidence that the technology works, and then partner them with experts in the industry, strategics and others to help them bring their product as quickly and efficiently to the market as possible with as much value as possible. And we're opening up our webinars to our broader ecosystem beyond that cohort. So if you're on the live stream, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And for our cohort companies, you can make use of the Zoom Q&A function. And we'll try and pose these questions in the hour we're together on the live stream. And once we conclude that live stream, speakers, if you could stay on for another 30 minutes of private Q&A with the companies, that would be amazing. That said, we recognize there's always time constraints, and so get your questions in when you can. But with that, it is my distinctive pleasure to host this panel today that is on the geography of growth, the geography of scaling. Does it actually matter where a startup is? Should one care? Should these startups care? We have cohort companies that are firmly established and have their headquarters and are thinking about scaling across the US. We have companies that are in other countries and are looking to establish themselves in the US. And so everybody is asking themselves, where should I be? Am I good where I am? Should I be somewhere else? And those are the types of questions we want to explore with our panel today. And so I will ask our panelists to introduce themselves, just because they've all 3 done great things and continue to do amazing things for the medtech community. And so I would much rather have them talk about themselves than me talking about them. I'll hand it first to Rachel Rath, who is at JLabs, and then hand it to Tracy, followed by Frank. Rachel, welcome. So glad to have you. Would you tell us a little bit about who you are and your work with JLabs?
Sure, Diane, and thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here and participate in the webinar. As Diane said, my name is Rachel Rath. I currently hold 2 titles within Johnson & Johnson Innovation. I am the director of our BARDA Alliance, and I'm also the interim head for JLabs at TMC at Texas Medical Center in Houston, Texas. So in my traditional day job, I'm the director of our BARDA Alliance and lead Blue Knight, which is a global partnership between Johnson & Johnson Innovation and BARDA within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where we look to support early stage companies that are mutually aligned to the strategies of both organizations. So that's often in the areas of pandemic preparedness and emerging infectious diseases. We have several medical device medtech companies within that portfolio today. And then at JLabs at TMC, I currently lead that incubator site, and JLabs is our global network of incubators for Johnson & Johnson Innovation. We have 13 locations around the world. Prior to joining Johnson & Johnson Innovation, which may be of interest to some of the folks on the line today, I worked for the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, where I helped set up NEST, the National Evaluation System for Health Technology Coordinating Center, which is an initiative with the US FDA on how to utilize real-world evidence and real-world data for regulatory science for medical devices. So I guess I will now pass it over to Tracy.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you, Diane, and the MedTech Innovator team for having us on. I'm really excited to be here in a conversation with all of you today. So I'm Tracy Dooley. I'm a partner at Avestria Ventures. Avestria is an early stage life science and healthcare venture firm based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we invest primarily domestically in the US. We're primarily focused in two areas that we believe are overlooked. And one of those is female founders in healthcare and life sciences, and the other is health of women, which is not just areas of reproductive health, but any area where women are impacted exclusively, differentially, or predominantly. So that includes things like neurodegenerative disease or autoimmune disease or cardiovascular disease. So really a personalized medicine approach. We tend to focus on early stage, seed and A, and coming from an operational background before joining Avestria, I did my MD at Stanford. I am a biomedical engineer by training, and then I was at Novartis leading diagnostics, leading strategy, and then global operations, but also building out the innovation pipeline there, and working with early stage companies at the Novartis Digital Accelerator Lab and the Gates Foundation. And so my whole career has sort of been around full life cycle, but particularly focused in how do you think about getting technologies and innovative technologies from the bench all the way to the bedside. So I'm really pleased to be here in conversation with folks, and I'll pass it on to Frank.
Thank you, Tracy. And Diane, thank you for having me today. My name is Frank Chistalki. I'm the VP of Intelligence at the Medical Alley Association. We're the trade group for the healthcare and health technology industry here in Minnesota. I always tell people, think Mayo, Medtronic, and United Health Group, plus 14,000 other healthcare and health technology companies. I have the good fortune of leading our global and our startup programs. So we work with startup companies from around the world to help them find capital, customers, and talent. And if those companies are outside of the United States, we support them on US market entry. Most of that work has been focused on Asia Pacific, a little bit in Northern Europe, and then Canada. But we work with companies from all over the world, and it's been a pleasure working with the MedTech Innovator team for a number of years now. And so glad to be here today.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that introduction. As you can see, folks, it's an esteemed panel. And what you can also tell is they're not all in Boston or San Francisco. And when having a discussion around does geography matter, it was important to us to really have that representation. Rachel, you're currently spanning two areas, and so I'll start with you when talking about geography, personally, but also more broadly as an organization. How does geography impact how you interact with organizations? Is it compartmentalized? Oh, if you're in Texas, you're currently at TMC, then talk to these folks? Or is it really more broad geographically? How do you interact depending on different geographies?
Yeah, so Johnson & Johnson Innovation is part of Johnson & Johnson overall, which is, of course, a very large global company. And Johnson & Johnson Innovation is really built around the idea that a great idea can come from anywhere. Those next innovative technologies that are going to help serve patients could be coming from ideas anywhere around the world. So we've created a global network to engage with innovators and entrepreneurs wherever they are. So we have 4 innovation centers based in hubs around the world. Those are more of those traditional areas, San Francisco and Boston, Shanghai and London. And then our 13 incubators span all over the world as well. Most of those are in North America, spread across East Coast, West Coast, and then TMC in the middle of the country in Texas, as well as Shanghai, Beersa, Belgium, and Toronto, Canada. But it doesn't matter where you are when you engage with us physically or geographically. We triage applications based on that strategic alignment to us as an organization. So when you think about Johnson & Johnson's sectors, you have the pharmaceuticals, med device, consumer, and cross-sector plays as well. Regardless of where you're engaging with us globally, you're going to be sort of engaged with through the appropriate therapeutic area. And then we all work collaboratively around the world. So as you said, Diane, I sort of sit in 2 different roles right now. One is based at TMC, although currently I'm up in New England, and usually I'm based in Washington, DC. So we're all floating around these days in different geographic areas. But even in Houston, we look at, yes, JLabs at TMC is based in Houston, but how can we support innovators and entrepreneurs regionally across the Midwest? How can we support entrepreneurs that may be based in St. Louis where we don't have a JLabs incubator, through that connection too? And then through the Blue Knight program, we really do look to engage innovators and entrepreneurs globally and work with our partners to source wherever people are in the world. So in the Blue Knight program, we have a company that's based in Australia. We have companies based in Europe. We have a company in Canada. We're engaging with innovation ecosystems in Africa and Latin America really as well.
Frank, I'll turn it to you and say you mentioned you often operate as a landing pad, as an attraction to your geographic area. So you have a geographic focus. How does that work, and what are the arguments you hear for or against your geography?
Yeah, when we engage with a company, particularly an OUS company, the conversation I try to have with them is, what are the assets that they need to build their business? And then where are they going to find those assets? Often the companies, especially early stage companies, are almost entirely or myopically focused on capital as an asset, which fundamentally you need the capital to buy things. But you need to be able to buy the things, you need to be able to hire the people, you're going to need to do deals with strategics, you need access to the customers. There are a range of assets that a company might need, and there are different places around the world that have different concentrations of those assets. And so, I'm a big fan of starting with the end in mind and thinking about, where is a company trying to end up as a business? And then where might they be best positioned geographically, in this case, to have that success? In the case of Medical Alley, right, we have a bias. Our job is to grow this ecosystem, and we've done that very well for 40 years. But when we're talking with the company, if you're building the next new hip or shoulder product, you might want to be in Warsaw, Indiana, where there's an incredible concentration of orthopedic companies. There might be very few other reasons you would ever find yourself in Warsaw, Indiana, but for building an orthopedic implant company. And for most people who are not close to that industry, they may not think of that. So we talk about the assets. Where would you find the people? Where are the buyers? Where are the customers? Where are the capital? And then make decisions about how you can best position your company to have long-term success, whether that's building a commercial organization or doing a deal and getting bought by a J&J or some other strategic.
Really appreciate that. Tracy, your from what you explained, your thesis is really around the asset and around the startup. I didn't hear a geography in there at all. Talk to us a little bit more about that. Does geography matter?
Absolutely. So I think, our premise around this is that we invest in the fundamentals of a company, right? Do you have good science? Do you have a good technology? Are you going to build a good product? And can you build a great business out of that, right? And as we've heard, that can really come from anywhere, right? And so when you're thinking about med tech, anything from, non-invasive sensors all the way through to class 3, right? There's obviously a range here, but I think what we really appreciate is somebody who has really thought through what that appropriate plan is for themselves. We absolutely do consider investments overseas as well. Generally, we like to understand what the strategy is from a U.S. market entry standpoint, right? But we are not geographically constrained, and actually, we've got portfolio companies that are out of Northern Virginia, out of Michigan, Texas, and then New York, and then some in the standard hubs as well. But I think that we absolutely have an appreciation for the startups that we've seen coming out of places like Indiana, where Lilly is an enormous presence, right? And there are, obviously, Minneapolis and like Texas. And so I think that that's something that really doesn't factor, that is not a criteria that excludes anybody, right? And we actually think that entrepreneurs coming from those areas might have a leg up because they can put together those assets and those fundamental value add teams, where they are.
And perhaps to all three of you, did have the last 2 years where most of us were in one way or another stuck at home. changed your perspective or changed the way that you interact with companies? Specifically, have they changed your perspective on geography? And it could be that the answer is simply no. And
well, I'll make a simple answer and say I think yes. But of course, no answer is actually that simple. I think for us, it's one thing to think about incubators as a physical space, and our incubators around the world do offer biolabs and chem labs and prototyping labs and the office space that companies need. But companies also often need so much more than just that physical space, right? It's about community and mentorship and access to suppliers at a discounted rate. And how do you connect with investors, and educational programming as wraparound business expertise. And I think for us over the last couple of years, we've had opportunities for companies to engage with us virtually before. So that virtual engagement model is not necessarily new, but I think we've done a better job of increasing our engagement with companies wherever they are, right? Not every company happens to be physically located near one of these 13 J Labs we have around the world. And not every company needs physical incubator space. So I think over the last 2 years, we've done a better job at meeting companies where they are through engaging with them virtually. And sometimes that transitions with time. So we've had companies that start virtually over the last year, and maybe they're ready to move into new space. And I think we may talk about it in a little bit, but some of that has to do sometimes with where your funding is coming from as well. And so we have companies that have started engaging with us virtually, getting mentorship and educational programming and being part of that community, particularly during 2 years when many of us were sitting at home and you weren't in the incubator space necessarily grabbing coffee and brainstorming about your next ideas. So I think that virtual community has been increasingly important as well.
I'm looking at the other two. If you have something to add to that, Tracy.
Yeah, I would echo that, right? I mean, I think we already, our thesis is really about finding overlooked opportunities, right, that deliver outsized returns. And so I think we already sort of had a bias towards how do we look in areas that are not your typical Silicon Valley, the Boston hubs and things like that. And I think that there are so many great ideas there. The pandemic clearly has really accelerated the opportunity to drive more efficiencies just in terms of meeting with folks, having initial conversations, right? Being able to get access to better talent, right? And being able to connect folks, within our networks as well. And so while it was a lot more difficult prior to this, I have an appreciation for the silver lining that we have this opportunity now to really be much more broad in a much more robust way than was previously possible.
I would echo the kind of the leveling up piece of greater front end access because of Zoom and Teams and all of that. We're also starting to see more and more of a clustering where increasingly the startup companies we're working with, they don't have one office. They have multiple small offices. It might be a J Labs in a co-working space, so that they're ending up in a situation where it is neither fully remote, you are anywhere on Earth, nor you are all in one place. That I think the virtual environment has made it easier to have those first connections and really figure out, is it worth spending more time? But it's also reinforced the value that humans as social animals place on connectivity and community, and we're creating new ways of doing it. We have so many companies today that I can't tell you where they're actually headquartered because the executives are in different places. There's multiple offices. There's a cluster here. There's a grouping of them, but it's no longer the 50 people in one spot operating as one company.
Frank, I would really echo that. I'd really echo what Frank's saying. We're seeing so many companies either expand into multiple J Labs locations because they're having employees sitting on either side of the country or even in different areas around the world. And then as an early stage company, having to decide, are you investing in equipment yourself, right? Are you actually procuring capital equipment, or are you, as your team is getting geographically diversified, do you want to be partnering with incubators to use some of that shared capital equipment? wherever you are in the world, and how can you leverage that? And we've definitely seen more of that, and also expanding footprints maybe into where you have collaboration. So if you have academic partners in a different geographic city, do you move into a small footprint there, and not even footprints where you have to be 100% of the time, but where you're looking to expand a team, do you have a smaller office or access to a lab where you maybe go once a month or for 1 or 2 days a week, depending how geographically disparate your team is. So I think we're seeing a lot more flexibility in company geography models.
That's super helpful. There's a couple of things, a couple of threads here I'd like to continue to pull on. I think from this discussion, right, I'm hearing teams, I'm hearing labs, I'm hearing partners, all of these. I do want to follow on a bit. Let me just because we're talking, one of the last things you just said, Rachel, was expensive capital equipment. And one of the things when we asked our companies, what in the best case will you get out of this accelerator? What will you get out of MedTech Innovator if everything goes well? Some answered, we really need to figure out where to put our lab. Where should we be? And so I want to ask the question, and that's not every company's situation, fully understood, right? But where does one put a lab? And what should one look at when opening a lab? So is it the equipment? Is it the location? How do I identify what is a good incubator, or where is a good incubator, and what are the amenities or benefits of that incubator? And I'll start with you, Rachel, just because that is, of course, something that JLabs has at the core of their business. But I do want to know the opinions of the other two panelists as well on that one, because that's a question all three of you probably hear.
Yeah, so I think it varies for every company, right? And it varies depending on what the company needs and is looking for. If you're a very small company, and JLabs accepts companies of a range of sizes. One of the strengths that I think about our model is our space is incredibly modular. So you can come into JLabs and have one lab bench in a shared common lab. You can have access to the prototyping lab, and maybe by the time you leave that JLab space after several years, you're in a private lab for 20 people, right? You can grow and scale with us. But when you're first potentially moving into an incubator or identifying what you need in terms of lab space, I think it's important to talk to the incubators, frankly. Is it equipment? Get a list of that equipment, but also ask questions. What would you like to see? We're always wanting to know from our companies, what type of equipment would you like to see in the lab? And we're always looking to invest in new pieces of equipment. So what's the equipment that's there? There's sort of the core, what do you need to advance your science and technology, right? What space do you need? How many people do you need to be in that space? What's that occupancy? What pieces of equipment do you need to do that? Are there partners in the area? So JLabs at TMC, for example, located right in the heart of Texas Medical Center, located next door to Johnson & Johnson Center for Device Innovation. Right? So additional equipment there, additional potential expertise and partners, all part of that same ecosystem. You also look at the Texas Medical Center, incredible healthcare system with research and innovation going on. You also then look at some of our other JLab sites. JLabs at Washington, D.C., for example, is on an integrated research and innovation campus for Children's National Hospital. So while it's not pediatric specific, incredible pediatric expertise sitting on that campus with outpatient clinics right there on campus, truly patients right on campus into the innovation labs back for clinical trials, right? There's so much innovation in different areas. So who are those partners at the site? They're always funding questions too, right? Like, who are those strategic partners or strategic funders nearby? Different states have different economic funds, different financial opportunities. Washington, D.C., you're sitting right down the street from NIH. If you're working with the federal government, strong interest in non-dilutive funding, that's there too. So I think when you think about there's sort of that core, what do you need to have to accelerate your science and run your company? And then you sort of start to span out into what are those nice to haves and maybe non-essentials if you're looking to recruit talent. What's the expertise coming out of those nearby universities? What's the job market like there? Is it incredibly competitive, or is there a little bit more slack in that job market? So those are some of the things that I think our companies in particular are thinking about today.
Tracy, can I go to you and say, if you invest in a company, your advice as to how they should best spend that money is asked for. And so is J Labs is known as a marquee type incubator that comes with a certain price tag. How do you look at that? How do you look where to go and what to look for a startup that you're working with?
Absolutely. I think, as Rachel pointed out, right, it's so dependent on what that specific startup needs, and not just what they need, but what they need at that point in their life cycle, and then how they think about what they will need in future, right? So when you're thinking about, potentially tech transfer, right? We talked to a lot of folks who are, already sort of geographically centered because of, spinning technology out of an academic center, that sort of anchors them into one area, right? But then obviously thinking about what capital equipment they might need to spin that out is really important. We like to see that folks have thought critically about what their next 3 steps are, right? At least, like, how do you think about getting to exit? So not only how are you going to, get your technology on the bench, how are you going to develop your product, how are you going to think about your prototype, but then how are you going to scale it, right? Who are the partners that you're going to need, and who has that expertise, right? So oftentimes in Southern California, you've got a lot of folks who are familiar with manufacturing catheters and cardiac devices and things like that, right? So it's really around, to an investor, we want to know that you have thought really critically about not just branding, right, but who really has the assets that you need, right? Why does it make sense for you to be there, right? And I think that we absolutely appreciate the need for folks to be capital efficient. And then we also appreciate that, it's absolutely worth sort of spending more capital up front to minimize having to redo things later on, or minimize having to make changes later on as well, right? So I think it's really showing how all those steps fit together, and can you really build a strong, robust foundation in order to make sure that you are sort of eliminating some of the hurdles that might come your way later on. And I really want to emphasize that, as valuable as equipment is, right, and the physical space, right, the intellectual capital that you're able to access is incredibly valuable when you're at a hub, right? So whether that ends up being sort of more of a virtual hub in one area, or maybe you've got a great collaboration with, say, a photonics lab in Ireland or something like that, and you're getting algorithm expertise from somewhere else, and then you're really working on the bench in one area. I think that the last few years have absolutely enabled folks to sort of virtualize, to be able to optimize how they think about strategically planning to put all those things together. So there can be more difficulties in doing it virtually, but then we've also seen that folks have been able to really plan and take advantage of that too. So planning is extremely important, and I think a good case can really be made for anywhere.
Boy, now we've got no advice for these companies. Frank, at the very least, I know that you feel strongly about your ecosystem. That said, you also mentioned Warsaw, Indiana in an earlier question, right? So we've got the knees in Warsaw, we've got the catheters in Southern California. How do we pick? And so if you were to draw a smaller circle, who should pick to be in Minneapolis?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that question is you can look around for all the different assets, and I'd say think about the stage of company. There's a very different set of assets if you're a research pre-commercial, or I should even say if you're research versus you're in development, doing preclinical, clinical studies, going on to market, and then commercial phase. And you can dig into kind of micro clusters. So there are different places around the United States that have different specializations within the medtech and the diagnostic industry, right? So in addition, in Southern California, if you're in Orange County, you're probably doing ophthalmic or aesthetics, right? That is the capital of the world for it. And if you're doing one of those kinds of technologies, it is hard to think of a better place on earth to be. If you're doing an active implantable type of device, you're probably already in Minnesota. About 80% of the entire industry is here. But if you're doing an active implantable device, you're probably going to end up connected to this community. Or in hearing, or in certain areas of regenerative medicine, there are specialty clusters that have emerged all over the country. And what I would advise to a company is two things. One, think about supply chain early on. If you're intent to become a commercial company at some point and you're having to manage, 100 suppliers that are in 25 different states, you're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money project managing and moving product around. And there are very specialty supply chains that have developed in certain areas, like in Southern California with catheter manufacturing, where if you're doing that kind of work, it's not just the catheter manufacturing, but it's the companies that extrude the tubes, they make the guide wires, they do the delivery systems. You get an entire ecosystem around them that are in that specialized supply chain, down to preclinical labs and CROs that are more experienced in interventional products than diagnostic products. And so doing some research up front to identify, hey, where are other companies like yours already clustering can be kind of a cheat code to find talent, suppliers, and probably also the strategic partners that you may want to be acquired by. If you know Medtronic is who you're going to want to get bought by at some point, I would probably put my office somewhere near one of their appropriate offices because you'll bump into them at the grocery store, right? You'll see them at the movie theater, and you can establish that relationship and that credibility along the way that then's going to accelerate whatever outcome you're seeking. So again, I start with what are the assets your company needs to get to that outcome you desire, and then do a true search to identify where in the US might you find the best combination for what you're trying to accomplish in one place, or because of incubators and virtualization, in a couple of places that you can then integrate into.
Frank, I want to stay with you for a second and say, if I don't have you on speed dial as someone who knows where the industry is clustered, how do I find out? So how does a company learn where are the specific clusters that pertain to my industry?
I mean, I'd give you two quick answers. One would be Google patent search. It's a real easy way. Like, you can search for families of patents, and I promise you, you will find geographic concentrations of certain kinds of patents in certain places, and that'll give you a sense of it. The second one is you can actually just go on LinkedIn and you could type in whatever you want, search for people, and you'll find, we did this one recently for a company in the epilepsy space, and they were looking at Boston or Minneapolis. We were able to identify that there were 4 times the number of people working on epilepsy devices in Minneapolis as there were in Boston. So for their needs, they knew they could find a higher percentage of workforce. So yeah, Google patents and LinkedIn search are kind of my go-to if you don't know, one of the cluster or community organizations that has that info.
Very tangible advice there. Tracy, I saw you go off mute, but I also wanted to directly say, I wonder if you have a response to, if you want to be acquired by Medtronic, be in Minneapolis. Is that something you would say? Yeah, maybe that's a good way to look at it, or would you push back against that? And then more broadly.
Yeah, I was going to add on to Frank's comment, right? I mean, I think building the strategic relationship, however you can early on, is incredibly valuable. So whether that is bumping into them at the grocery store, right? Meeting them at conferences, we tend to deal again, right? Primarily post proof of concept, but very early. Seed and A is our sweet spot, right? So generally by the time, you're sort of hitting your, clinical trials and about to, submit for FDA approval and things like that and commercialize, you've got a much larger company, right? And there's a little bit less flexibility around geography, right? But I would say when you're thinking about, to the earlier point about supply chain, think about who the OEM manufacturers are, right? From a strategic standpoint, right? All these things, the more you can look like a big company and sort of set yourself up for an easier integration, right? Where you can say, we're already operating at this level of quality, right? So the more you can match them as much as possible, I think the easier it is for them to say, okay, great, like that's less of a risk. And that's something that we can really see ourselves engaging with this company and bringing them on, right? And acquiring them, right? So I think that that's going to mean, again, different things for different types of, med tech companies, but the more you can align yourself with a strategic is really important. And so, so geography does tend to play a role in that when you're thinking about supply chain, OEM, and things like that, and being able to just scale to the appropriate size.
Rachel, J&J is one of our strategic partners, and so that alignment with the strategic is I'm going to say a question that I'd like to put straight to you.
Well, I'd actually like to sort of echo what Frank said and what Tracy said, and maybe even tie them together as well, where I completely agree with what Frank was saying about building relationships. I don't think you have to be geographically located near someone to be bumping into them at the grocery store, but I think building those more ongoing relationships where you have rapport is incredibly valuable. And to Tracy's point, I think that there is something to be said for going out to the conferences and events and just networking and meeting other like-minded innovators and entrepreneurs. It's also a great way to meet investors and larger strategics. And that first conversation you have isn't, and Tracy may agree with me here, isn't necessarily a, hey, do you want to invest in my company conversation, but it can lead down the line to that, right? We hear stories from companies going after funding and they've applied for the same opportunity 5 times before they get a yes. Sometimes it's about changes in strategies from an early stage company or from the strategic. Sometimes it's just where you are in development. And sometimes those early conversations where you're building rapport, you can gain insights into, okay, when should I come back to a J&J, right? When should I come back to different investors when I have those pieces of data that they're looking for? And build those relationships too, so you can come back and just have a conversation. We always encourage companies when they're applying to connect with Johnson & Johnson Innovation, or in particular J Labs, apply. You may get declined, but hopefully with that decline, we'll be able to give you some feedback that says, you're not on strategy, or here's where there may be some interest. Come back to us at these different points in time. And really, when we say, come back to us with updates, keep us updated on your progress, we're being sincere about that. It's terrific to get emails from companies that say, hey, we just had, this exciting update. We'd love to share it with you. Wonderful, because maybe their strategy has changed. Maybe our strategy has changed and we have alignment all of a sudden. So staying connected, building those relationships, I think is incredibly important with investors, with strategics. And I think a big part of that is conferences. I also think, to Frank's point of figure out what's going on in the local region, the local conferences are a great way to do that, whether that's Life Science Innovation Northwest, whether that's Maryland Life Sciences. You go online and look at the agendas, see who their speakers are, see those areas of expertise, and connect with them, learn about the ecosystem that way as well.
I could not agree more, of course. We will definitely see the MedTech innovator companies in October at AdvaMed in Boston, and in November in San Francisco. So we're definitely fully buying into the consistency of seeing people time and again, whether at the supermarket or somewhere else. Several of you brought up supply chain. That is critical for a number of folks, and critical enough that we're having an MTI live next week on supply chain. But while I have you here, supply chain partners really matter here and elsewhere. And so I would love to know how you look at how developed a supply chain is of a particular startup, where you can potentially plug in and make connections. And again, the supply chains at this point are globally anyway. My assumption is geography doesn't play into that at all, but I'd love to hear your opinion on at what stage the supply chain conversation comes into a company. And I might just ask Frank first, because I always ask the others first. And I see some questions from our companies coming in as well. Just want to notice that I noticed the question, and we'll get to those in a second. Frank.
Yeah, I mean, in supply chains from day one, I think very few startups are vertically integrated, at least not for a very long time. And the choice of your supplier partners can make or break a company. You know, Tracy had mentioned earlier about it's better to spend the money up front to do things right the first time. That plays out so much in the supply chain, whether it's manufacturing, your clinical or preclinical programs, or even your marketing and brand work. It's an area where I will say I quite often see entrepreneurs who have been there, done that, do it very well and do it early, and newer entrepreneurs who will try to keep a lot of things that are not core to the business, right? The fundamental technology you're developing, that you're probably doing internally or with a very specific strategic partner. But I see far too often simple things like building a website. Why are you spending your time building your own website unless it's nothing more than a one-page website? So I think it's important from day one, and it is well worth spending the money to get the right ones and the good ones than to have to go and redo a quality system a year from now. If you've ever been through that, you will never make that mistake again.
I'm going to see who of the two of you, Tracy or Rachel, wants to chime in. I think the quality system is definitely one could pull on, but a broader supply chain or quality system, when and how do you look at that?
I think it's really important to have a strategy from day one, right? As we all know, right, from an investor perspective, we absolutely acknowledge, and especially with operational experience, we know that what you're putting on paper, the only thing we know about it is that it's going to be different when you look back at it, right? Several years from now. However, it's really important that you've thought through what those assumptions are, that we can understand what your thought process is, right? And how you're making those assumptions and what assumptions you're making, right? That's what gives us confidence, right? It doesn't give us confidence to say, oh, it's fine, right? It's all taken care of, right? And this person's best, right? We want to hear, here's the risks that I've identified and here's how I'm mitigating them. And this is why, in the context of all these risks that we've identified, this is why, we're going this direction, right? And that helps us, right? Because as investors, the investors are not the expert in your area. You are the expert, and we're relying on you to be the expert, right? So you're the one who's going to need to be 3 steps ahead of us, right? And I think, as Frank pointed out, with the experienced entrepreneurs, right, who can say, okay, I've been down this road before, or I've done this before, in industry, and so I'm doing this now for my own company, right? That's extremely helpful to hear, because, we're absolutely there to support you and to bring in our networks and to be able to help you with that. But again, right, our networks are much more generalized than yours in this specific area. So the combination of experience and thinking through that strategy and having a good reason for why you're doing that, I think to us is more important than, what specifically you're doing, right? Because I think making a good argument for why you're in a particular area or why you're going with a particular supplier is really important. But I do agree, right? Oftentimes it's, being forward thinking and really not making, startups run very lean, right? But making a good argument for why you're making a strategic investment. And we're investing because we believe that there's a growth opportunity there, right? So I think it's important to, again, focus on the fundamentals and get things right the first time, because we've seen very expensive mistakes happen, even at big companies, and we want to just avoid those.
Rachel.
Yeah, I'd answer that question from a few different ways, actually. So what we're looking for in terms of companies in this area really depends actually on how you're engaging with Johnson & Johnson Innovation. So Johnson & Johnson Innovation, we have sort of a spectrum of how we engage with early stage companies and later stage companies, everything from the JLabs Incubator Network, to our innovation centers that do have some deal-making capabilities, to JJDC, which is our strategic venture fund, to Janssen Business Development, which is doing later stage licensing and acquisition. So it really depends where on the spectrum that is, right? If you're applying into JLabs, you're an early stage company, we're not going to necessarily looking at supply chain, and that's not part of our application process. Now, looking at your team and the strength of the team is, and that includes partners and who you're working with. But that looks different than if you're looking at a partner at an investment from JJDC. What we are looking for is different depending on those different stages. But I think one of the things that's important as part of JLabs is that companies have access to mentorship. And that is for all JLabs companies, from mentorship from the Johnson & Johnson family of companies. For companies that are part of my program, Blue Knight, that's mentorship from Johnson & Johnson, as well as mentorship from BARDA within the US Department of Health and Human Services. I think companies have a tendency to think about mentorship from a scientific standpoint. What are those proof points? What is that data collection you would like to see in order to eventually do a deal or make an investment? Sure, that may be part of mentorship, but mentorship, I actually think some of the best examples we've seen about mentorship come more on actually the manufacturing side and the partnership side. And that's where your mentors can help you think through, not necessarily, they're not going to vet the companies for you, and they're not going to say necessarily, here's who I would recommend, particularly when you're talking about mentorship with BARDA, where it's government and they're not going to match make for you. But thinking through those critical questions that you're asking when, as an early stage company, you're vetting your partners and you're vetting those manufacturers you may be working with, going through those questions and those responses with mentors, making sure there aren't gaps in what you're asking, making sure you're avoiding some of those pitfalls so that you're selecting the right or as close to the right manufacturing partner you can the first time, so that you don't have to pay some of those incredibly costly mistakes down the line, or at least minimize those. The last thing I would just add on is on the JLab side, one of the things we have for our companies is a resource hub. And that's where service providers, it's a sponsored opportunity. Service providers offer their services, whether that's direct supplies or whether that's consulting services. It's really a whole range at a discounted price for JLabs companies. So you have sort of the negotiating power of a lower price point for sort of this consortium of all of these companies. But it's a great way to think about, what are you insourcing and outsourcing? I think Frank's example of a website, great example. I was talking to a company the other day that told me, no, I'm just gonna do the HR work, who the CEO said. And it's like, well, you can. Is it the best use of your time and talent? I don't know. Is it worth getting some outside support to do some HR work? Maybe, but thinking about HR, legal, website services, marketing services, what are you going to insource versus outsource? And we do support the companies for that through the resource hub.
I appreciate that. One of the things I wanted to at least, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about it in the context of geography, is we've seen, especially over the past decade, companies, especially larger companies, moving their headquarters to other countries for tax considerations. And so I'll start with Frank, just because that's one of the pieces of conversation you and I had preparing for this panel. Do tax considerations even play for startups? When I choose where to be in the US or somewhere else, do tax considerations play for startups? Does it matter whether I'm in Minnesota or somewhere else? And then more broadly than tax considerations, what else should I be looking at? And so this is a very geography centric question, but I know that companies are asking themselves that. Frank, how about taxes? Does it make sense for me to headquarter in Minnesota?
Yeah, so the most famous example of that was Medtronic converting after the Covidian purchase. And now with the federal tax reforms that have gone on, the tax benefit is no longer there. It always cracks me up when I see Dublin as the press release for any of this stuff, because Jeff and the whole team are still right here in Fridley, just outside of Minneapolis. If you're a pre-revenue company, your tax situation is pretty de minimis, right? You have to have profits to pay corporate income tax. Your property taxes, you're probably in an incubator or you're renting a space, it's baked into your rent. Your individual income taxes may vary, and if you have a big gigantic exit and you become independently wealthy, you may have estate taxes or other considerations. So there's like 500 factors that go in, but there's one thing that I see companies fundamentally misunderstand on corporate tax over and over again, that they drive some business decisions on, and it's not based in fact. So in almost every state in the United States, your corporate income tax is based solely on the sales that you make in that state. It's called single source factor. As a result of that, the corporate income tax that your business pays in Minnesota or in California or in Florida or in Texas is entirely based on the sales you make in the state, not in the presence you have in the state. So if you have your entire team at JLabs at Texas Medical Center and you get Mayo Clinic as a client and they are 100% of your sales, you will pay corporate income tax to the state of Minnesota. And conversely, if you are in Minnesota and 100% of your sales are going to California, you will pay corporate income tax to California. And in some cases, in some products, you may even pay sales tax, which is a weird thing, that there are some medical products that are not exempted from sales tax. So on the tax side of things, I think businesses at an early stage get far too hung up on it, where it does not end up having that much of an impact. If you are a globally operating $50 billion company, that is a very different situation that we all aspire to get to, I'm sure. But at the stage most of us here are talking about, it's really not a consideration that you should worry about. It will be such a teeny part of the dollars that you are spending that the amount of time you spend thinking about it probably just cost any benefit you might get from locating in a supposedly low tax realm.
And while that was a very Frank specific question, I am curious as to any anecdotes or examples that either Tracy or you, Rachel, have. And no is a fine answer because I would otherwise move on to talent questions. So I'm kind of just checking if there's any commentary you have on the tax basis.
The only comment really I would add would be, do your homework. It varies so much by state, whether that's taxes or whether that's the local funding available or restrictions that come and requirements that come with state funding or local funding. Do your homework and know what you're applying to, and any consequences is a little bit of a negative word, but any repercussions for the funding you may receive there, and just be aware of it before your time is very valuable as an early stage company, and that includes applying for funding opportunities. Those take effort, time and effort. And so when you're thinking about where you want to be located and the benefits, just do your homework and know what you're applying to and those different state and geographic qualifications.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think just on paper, right? And from an investor standpoint, everybody's going to be a Delaware C Corp. So from a headquarters perspective, wherever you're located, right? Again, as Frank pointed out, the pre-revenue companies, your tax impact is de minimis. When you think about economic development zones or groups and things like that, that is, as Rachel pointed out, that's something to look into, right? I mean, I know that New Jersey, for example, has some tax breaks from an investor standpoint, right? But again, don't let the tail wag the dog, right? You want to build the best company you can with the best, and Diane will talk about talent, with the best talent you can. And I think the taxes are just something that's going to be, you get people to manage that, right? You can talk to your attorneys, you can talk to your finance folks, but it shouldn't be something that you should be really trying to change your entire company strategy around, especially at an early stage.
Looking at the time, the last bigger topic in that context that I did want to and that I didn't want to talk about is talent, just because startup talent is I think right now everybody's talking about a talent war, be that large companies, be that small companies. Getting the best talent and retaining the best talent is hard. And while many of us work remotely. There's still something to be said, especially for an early stage company, to be somewhat co-located. So I would love to hear your perceptions or your experiences and anecdotes around, is talent something that should make you pick one geography over another? And what have you seen people do successfully in the context of talent?
I'll jump in here and I'll say that talent is the thing that's, from an investor perspective, that's going to make or break your company, right? Because you've got, assuming you have a technology and you can de-risk that, you can build a product, but what you're really building is a business. And to build that business, you know, you're not going to go it alone, and you need the folks that are going to do that with you. So there are many different ways to get talent, either from an advisory and consulting perspective or, you know, from a full-time hire. And I think one of the things that we've seen that really helps us de-risk that is folks who have worked together before and done things together before. And I think that absolutely can supersede geographic distance, right? That being said, if you are a new team, there is something to be said for being able to generate sort of that community and that camaraderie in working together, whether that's, you know, hybrid and you bring people together. But I think it's really important to have that team culture as well, to have everybody aligned, because we've seen, and I've personally seen in so many large organizations that you've got, like, one person can be actively detrimental to the success of an entire program. And that's even more is at stake at a startup, right? So being able to rely on folks who you can really trust, I think, is critical. And then the geography is secondary to that.
Hiring is really hard right now. We're seeing it across our portfolio companies. It's definitely a challenge right now. It's a challenge. It's an incredibly hard market for that. I think I agree with Tracy. Team dynamic is incredibly important, and building that culture and having the right people in the right roles, not just bodies who can do the work, but who are those right people for your team. Whether that means, you know, you need someone in the office full time, or can that person be located, you know, somewhere else and fly in once a month or have that FaceTime? I think that's a company decision. I do have companies in my portfolio who say, well, this person has to be based here, but we can't afford the talent here. And then the question is, okay, well, then something has to give, right? Then you have to either figure out a different compensation package and work maybe with a consultant to do that. How are you compensating your employees? Or can you be more flexible on where they're located? You can't always have everything, and understanding your core values as a company and where you're willing to sort of push those a bit. One of the things that I've seen be challenging for startup companies actually in terms of hiring is some of those what may be considered sort of fundamentals of hiring. Some of the pitfalls we've even heard are, well, I don't have a website to post jobs, right? I post on Indeed and I have to, you know, keep re-upping it, or I'm posting on platforms where I have to pay for postings, and you're more reliant on something that's passive. So even some of those fundamentals of having a website where you can post your own announcements, particularly if you're posting for a number of jobs that you can then sort of showcase together. And where people can go to learn about your team. When people are applying to jobs, they want to see who are they going to be working with, who are their peers going to be, what's the expertise of that company. And pitching a company for potential employees is a different pitch than pitching your company to investors. And that's something I don't always see companies sort of navigate smoothly. And I think it's an important note.
I would just add to that last point that particularly in the environment we are in today, where unemployment is very low, and even if things slow down, demographics suggest it's going to be a tight labor market going forward. Startup companies, I think, have to become very good at recruiting and retaining at a much earlier phase in their development than maybe they used to. Things like employer branding, CEOs who can sell the vision to employees, not just to investors, are going to be difference makers for companies. The ones who can get the great talent versus the ones who can't, all else being equal, that company with the great talent is probably going to win, get the capital, get to market, get the acquisition, whatever it might be.
Really
Frank, you hit
appreciate
though
it.
on, but it is recruiting, and then the second piece is how do you retain it?
Could not agree more. And we will be hosting an MTI Live specifically on talent, just because that is so important to all of our startups. Many of them are actively growing and are posting jobs. And so finding and retaining and incentivizing, there's many facets to that. We will talk about that more. We are on top of the hour. I want to make sure that I thank our panelists while we bid our YouTube audience goodbye. We do this every week. Please come back next week. Looking forward to having you. And with that,